In medieval warfare, it's always so interesting to look at the armies, how they were organized, were they effective, what different approaches were used in a battle. So let's have a look at Muslim and Arab armies in the medieval times. Welcome to the Golden Middle Age. The Muslim and Arab armies played such an important role in medieval history. What comes to mind straight away is the War of the Crusades, where the Muslim armies fought against the European armies. So many different tactics and styles of fighting were prevalent. Different weapons and different armor were used, but Muslim and Arab armies had a lot of influence on them. It wasn't purely Arab, and this is because Islam spread into so many different regions, interacting with many different cultures. Also, the Asian and Eastern influence had an effect on the development of weapons and armies. But by the medieval times, there were about three main influences we can say on Islamic warfare. And this is from an ethnic aspect. Arabs, Persians and Turks formed the core, and they all had their input on military warfare. We know the Turks came in the later Abbasid period in the 9th century, which eventually developed into the Mamluk institution, which we mentioned in our previous video. But the Central Asian influence became even greater after the Seljuk conquest of the Middle East. Arab nomads also kept their own identity when it came to armor and warfare. So what we can see is a mix of so many different ingredients, and what makes it even more difficult to narrow down and be specific is the amount of different empires and autonomous sultanates that emerged in the medieval Mediterranean. From the Mamluks to the Seljuks, the Ayyubids, the Buyids, the Fatimids, the Nizari Ismailis, it was like a cocktail made up of so many different fruits, and each would add its own flavor to the mixture. So let's try our best to dig deep and unravel this interesting aspect of medieval Arab and Islamic history. It can be fair to say what revolutionized the Arab and Muslim armies was the introduction of the mounted archer in the 9th century. This was a result of the Ghulams or Mamluks being taken from Central Asia and incorporated into the Arab armies by the Abbasids. The introduction of these Turkmen horse archers can illustrate the change in style of the Arab and Islamic armies, and could also show the beginning of the Central Asian influence on the armies of the Islamic world. These mounted archers were a game changer. The Turks were often referred to having 4 eyes, 2 at the front and 2 at the back of their head. And this was a policy which was sustainable for the early medieval Abbasid Empire and later Islamic empires as well, because to capture these young boys at the age of around 10 meant that they had probably survived many diseases and would likely live a long life. The mounted archers had so many advantages. Firstly, they can attack the opposing army, causing a lot of damage from a distance. They can hurt you without having to get close. Their bows and arrows attacked from a distance, and the thing is, by the time you attempted to recover and wanted to hit back, they had already rode away on their horses. It was almost like a cheat code, and it can possibly be compared to the English longbow, where damage was caused from a distance from that aspect. And a good example of this would be the Battle of Agincourt. So these mounted knights were incorporated, and the Arab used them in the same way they used the older cavalry forces in the 8th century. They would attack, retreat, and then attack again. So this attack and retreat tactic was kept going into the early medieval period. So imagine wave after wave of arrows hitting you, and you not being able to respond because of them being on horseback allowed them to be very, very mobile. But going into the 12th century, there seemed to be a decline in the mounted archer. But what we can also find is that small period in the early Middle Ages when the Abbasid Empire was declining, different autonomous and small entities emerged, and they actually had some fights with the Byzantine Empire. A few good examples to look at would be the Hamdanids. They emerged in Syria and lasted up until the 1000s, so we're still early medieval here. And they actually differed from their predecessors and preferred a mounted soldier with a traditional long Arab lance. And they would usually wear a padded gambeson or overcoat. Then in came the Persians, specifically the Samanid dynasty, which is still early Middle Ages. They had organized a method of warfare whereby they would place their infantry with their pikes and spears at the front. Then another row of infantry would be behind them, who would usually shoot arrows and throw spears. And behind this infantry which we'll speak about in a bit more detail next, will be the heavy cavalry. Again, the ghulams, or the Mamluk style horsemen, were utilized in almost every Islamic empire in the early Middle Ages. They would have armored horses, which we'll hopefully speak about in our next video. The Ghaznavids, who came after the Samanids, I know there's so many medieval Islamic empires to remember, they had also placed a heavy emphasis on horse archery. The Seljuks also utilized the ghulams, which could shoot from a distance on horseback, and this proved to be very, very useful, especially for sieges. Obviously, it wouldn't win you a battle on its own, but they caused severe damage. Now, moving on to the infantry and the different types. Infantry evolved in the medieval Arab and Islamic world. In traditional Arabian warfare, from the pre-Islamic era and even during the establishment of Islam, before a battle started, the army had to name a specific amount of foot soldiers or warriors, probably around 3 or 4. And then these warriors would then show themselves on the battlefield, and the other side would do the same and would also name their warriors or champions. And then a one-on-one fight would happen before the actual battle starts. So infantry was very important from the start. The Umayyads and Abbasids both used to bring mercenaries for the elite infantry soldiers. The Arab tribesmen were barely armed, whereas these mercenaries were experts in their trade. An example I would like to give is the Daylamis, who we can see were prominent in the early medieval period. The Daylamis were a tribe who lived in Daylam, which is near Tabaristan, and this is on the south of the Caspian Sea, which is the coast of Iran. And the Daylamis lived in extremely harsh conditions, and they grew up to be fierce warriors. They were strong and fearless on the battlefield. They were experts in fighting on mountains, woods, and anything which is rugged or had a rugged terrain. And even on the battlefield, they would form a shield wall, throwing their javelins and then battling with their axes, or swords, and round-shaped shields. And this would be very hard to break down. They were brutal fighters and were used as infantrymen for many medieval Islamic empires. Of course, some would be mounted soldiers, but most were infantry foot soldiers. They were lightly armored and were very disciplined. In addition to this, foot soldiers from Khorasan, which can be seen involved in the Arab and Islamic medieval armies. Then going into the 11th century, the Berbers from North Africa were deployed on the battlefield, which arguably changed warfare. Instead of using the attack and retreat tactics the Arabs were used to, they wouldn't retreat. They would just stay where they were, on the battlefield, and force the opponent into making mistakes by attacking them. So, to summarize everything, we can definitely see that there was this hybrid personality of early medieval Arab and Islamic armies, whereby you had different soldiers, different types of soldiers from different parts of the Islamic world fighting in one army under one flag. You had the infantry soldiers and the horse riders with a bow and arrow, and this formed a great balance. And the fact that there was different tribes and different ethnicities, this caused them to fight even harder to make sure they represented their original homeland in the bravest and strongest way. And this was definitely something the rulers of the time took advantage of. And in general, the Arab and Islamic armies preferred to use speed and mobility. And this is something that continued into the Middle Ages, and something you can also see in many of the battles, the famous battles between the West and the world of Islam in the Middle Ages. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, do make sure you give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you again very soon with our next episode on the Medieval Arab Knight, where we will talk about horses and their armor.